Today I would like to discuss with you some highly speculative remarks on art and the role of art in the Cultural Revolution. If I speak of art, I would like to emphasize that from the beginning. I mean the visual arts as well as music and literature, the generic term. Now, my remarks again, I'm afraid, will leave you correctly in a position where you will ask, what are we supposed to do about it? And I can only say what I said before, that a theory, and especially critical theory, cannot give any direct recipes for action. And still we can say, and it has been said by people who knew what they were talking about, that without theoretical guidance, practice, and especially political practice, is bound to fail. I am going to talk about the role of art in the Cultural Revolution, that is to say, as a potential or actual weapon in helping bringing about revolution. And I would like to start by saying that I think the term Cultural Revolution, as far as the West is concerned, it is entirely different in China. And I'm talking about the Cultural Revolution in the West, especially here in our own country. This expression is the sign of an embarrassment. Cultural Revolution, because obviously we are not in the middle of a political and economic upheaval, and still we are witnessing the all but collapse of many of the most cherished traditional cultural values. But whereas cultural revolution is on the one side an expression of an embarrassment, it is on the other side something very positive, namely it is expressive of the fact that social change today is of a total character, engulfing the entire society in all its dimensions, including, and perhaps today primarily including, non-material needs and values. And this total character of the upheaval going on before our eyes is first of all a problem of communication. The radical social change in process today calls for a new effective communication. It calls for a language, it calls for images capable of transmitting the rupture with the entire traditional culture. That is to say, in more technical terms, it calls for a non-reified, non-petrified language capable of withstanding the cooptive as well as suppressive powers of the establishment, a radically non-conformist language. A language which is not, as all traditional language is, not in its very substance and structure, shaped by and subjected to the requirements of the establishment. Now obviously such a radically non-conformist language cannot simply be invented. Language is nothing artificial that can be arbitrarily or not arbitrarily changed unless such change is in turn rooted in a massive objective base, in objective tendency. Such a language cannot be invented, and it doesn't have to be invented because it exists. And it exists primarily in the domain of the arts, in literature, music, and the visual arts. And the historical task is to activate this radical potential which has been blocked which has been turned to a great extent into a conformist medium by the established bourgeois culture. The aim of the Cultural Revolution in this respect is the desublimation of culture. The desublimation of culture, meaning undoing the illusory, idealistic, harmonizing quality of art, its transfiguration of the miserable reality, or in other words, the Cultural Revolution wants to undo the divorce of art from real life. And the Cultural Revolution sees the expression of these conformist, unreal, illusory qualities of traditional art in the aesthetic form. In the aesthetic form, I would like to point out, of course, that in this context I use the term aesthetic as it has come to be used, namely as the specific quality of art and not of sensibility in general. Now, this conformist character of art is supposed to be expressed in the aesthetic form, which imposes on art an order of its own, a truth of its own, preventing art from conveying the full reality of the human condition, preventing art from really contributing to the struggle for radical change. Now, instead of this traditional art, which is supposed to be essentially conformist, instead the Cultural Revolution wants to develop an immediate, sensuous, living culture which responds to and which activates not only the intellect, not only a refined, distilled, elitist sensibility, but rather activates and moves the body and the soul, moves the body and the soul not as vehicles of labor power and its recreation, not as vehicles of renunciation and repression in the interest of an exploitative society, but moves body and soul as vehicles of liberation. And inasmuch as the sublimating aesthetic qualities are at the very roots of bourgeois culture, the Cultural Revolution attacks this culture as a whole in its very roots. Now we have to ask the question, what is bourgeois culture? Because we cannot, from the beginning to the end, fall victim to a cliché if it turns out to be a cliché that is no longer livable. I would like to suggest that while the bourgeoisie is still the ruling class, its culture is no longer that of its historical predecessors. If it has any culture at all, it is neither the culture of its predecessors, neither in the material sphere, nor in the so-called higher culture. Why not? If we look at the material culture today, where is that economic asceticism, Max Weber's inner-worldly asceticism, which has been characteristic of the traditional previous material culture of capitalism? Where is the taboo on spending, on consumption, on conspicuous consumption in the so-called consumer society? What has happened to the moral puritanism which really or allegedly motivated the earlier stages of capitalism. What has happened to free individual enterprise? What has happened to free competition? They are no longer realities. And in the so-called higher culture of the bourgeoisie, we see what we have discussed before, the ingression into the establishment of pop art, rock festivals, the living theater, so-called pornography, sex as status symbol, commodity, all things which are in blatant contradiction to previous stages of bourgeois culture. Thus, we seem to be confronted with a very paradoxical phenomenon. Namely, the traditional bourgeois culture is rejected by the establishment, and it survives in the establishment still only as a lie, as hypocrisy, as ritualized performance. Now, when this is the case, the question must be asked, how can the cultural revolution sustain itself by developing its own nonconformist culture when its anti-culture itself is threatening to become a subculture of the establishment? And I propose to prepare a very preliminary answer, that in order to prepare the soil for a radical reversal of the repressive tendencies in the cultural tradition, the movement would have to recapture and restructure the authentically nonconformist, liberating qualities of traditional art. Are there such qualities? And if so, what are they? I would like to draw your attention first on a well-known phenomenon, which, however, I think has not been sufficiently emphasized, namely that a thoroughly anti-bourgeois stance permeates the entire art, literature, and music of the bourgeois culture. It is explicit in the representative literature of the bourgeois period. In all of them, you find a strict dissociation from the world of commodities, of the market, of commerce, the indictment of this world. You find in the representative literature of the period the indictment of bourgeois materialism and bourgeois greed. You find the dissociation from the indictment of the distortion of all human relationships in bourgeois society. And this is expressed negatively. I will try to explain it subsequently. This dissociation, this critical dissociation from the bourgeois reality, is expressed in the contemplative character of classical and romantic music, in the so-called Innerlichkeit, I don't know of an English translation, the internal sensitivity and sensibility of the subject, which is supposed to be the achievement of classical and romantic music, and it is expressed in its own language as against the language spoken in the material world. This is the literature in which men and women dare to live and to die for their passion, for their love, and for their hatred. Far from being merely the sublimation of the free economic subject of the bourgeois reality, the subject as it appears in the authentic art of this period is the rejection of the economic subject. The higher culture of the bourgeois period thus contains a methodical contradiction to the bourgeois reality of the period. However, and this is of course the decisive point, a contradiction or a negation which is never direct, never immediate, but which is always broken, internalized, sublimated by the aesthetic form. Now it is this aesthetic form in which, in my view, the nonconformist elements of traditional art are contained in the literal sense of confined. It is this aesthetic form which is attacked, which is supposed to be shattered in order to make way for a new liberating culture, for creative works which express and which can express the unsublimated reality, and which may appeal, works which may appeal to a consciousness and sensibility willing to change the established reality. Let me try to sum up the principal counts of the indictment of the aesthetic form in the Cultural Revolution. It is said that the aesthetic form creates a world of beautiful illusion, that it creates an artistic, that is to say synthetic and unreal harmony and order in the midst of conflict and disorder, that it champions a poetic justice which glorifies and reconciles with the miserable reality. And this illusory fulfillment, this reconciling aesthetic pleasure, turns into a resigned affirmation of the social order. Consequently, repression of the rebellious energy of the life instincts, repression of the liberating destruction that would precede radical social change, and inasmuch as this kind of repression is inherent in the very form, aesthetic form of traditional art, art becomes a factor of stabilization, adjustment, renunciation. Art indeed has functioned as what Aristotle called the catharsis. Art had in the tradition a therapeutic function, a cure. But the cure, the therapy, is false. Mind and body were supposed to be cured, purged, precisely from those disturbing energies which rebel against massive reconciliation and adjustment. By virtue of this therapy, man forgets what is done to him and what he can do against it. And in this therapy, eliminating all the truly rebellious energies of the life instincts, by virtue of this therapy, he can find comfort in a higher order, comfort in a so-called higher truth, which turned out to be unreal. I would like to read to you words that were spoken by Herbert Reed long before the present Cultural Revolution, at the first International Surrealist Congress in London in the 30s, where he said, and I quote, "Let it be stated without further preface, classicism represents for us now and has always represented the forces of oppression. Classicism is the intellectual counterpart of political tyranny. The norms of classicism are the typical patterns of order, proportion, symmetry, equilibrium, harmony, and all of those are static and inorganic qualities. They are intellectual concepts which control and repress the vital instincts on which growth and therefore change depend." You will see to what extent these words foreshadow and anticipate what is said today. Again and again you read in the radical and especially underground press the accusation of the traditional art as repressive the life instincts. In many cases you read clearer as repressing the sexual and erotic energies of man. I must make a personal remark here. I remember with great delight a skit, I think by Nichols and May, of two young people lying in bed together and listening to Bach and having a hell of a good time by listening to it. I personally could never understand why this kind of music, or if it is not Bach, let's say Beethoven, which is most frequently quoted, is repressive of sexual energy. And I remember that Tolstoy, who knew something about sexuality, saw in Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata one of the most erotic and one of the most stimulating pieces in music. But I leave the decision to you. And I want to go back to Herbert Reed's word. The affirmative character, the conformist character of art exists. The question is where, and whether it resides in the aesthetic form, and whether the aesthetic form is essentially repressive today. I would like to offer two hypotheses. First, the artistic destruction of the aesthetic form is historically premature, an inadequate, vicarious revolt based on a false evaluation of the present situation. And secondly, the artistic destruction of the aesthetic form is self-defeating. It cannot attain what it wants to attain. And I want to discuss briefly these two hypotheses. First, what is the aesthetic form? Of course, I cannot go here into any really adequate analysis, so it must suffice to say that the aesthetic form is, in my view, one of the lasting expressions of the social contradiction between the potential and the actual. The contradiction between the potential and the actual. And the language and images of art communicate that which is not yet communicable in reality. Language and images which may reveal an otherwise inexpressible and invisible truth. That which is as it really is, and that which could be and which ought